Hi, I'm George Mueller, and this is an introduction to the late medieval period for students in my History 101 class. Today we're going to do things a little bit differently than we have in the past. Instead of an overview of the chapters, we're going to look at a few areas that I think need a little more description. The first one is going to be medieval architecture. The style of architecture that developed after the fall of the Carolingian Empire became known as the Romanesque style. But it does differ from Roman architecture in a number of ways. For one thing, it's often taller, and as you can see in this picture, it has a uniquely fortress-like characteristic. If you think back to Greco-Roman temples, they were very open and airy. Romanesque cathedrals aren't. They look like a fortress. In times of trouble, they're a place you can run and hide. And that's because the reality of the era was that it was dangerous. There were raids by Vikings and Muslims and your neighbors, wherever you were. So you needed a place to hide. And churches were a community, essentially community bomb shelter. Compared to Roman buildings, they had very thick walls. And these thick walls were massively strong. And this allowed the buildings to be taller than Roman buildings generally were. Emphasizing this tallness was vaulting on the inside. This provided architectural stability, but also beauty, as you can see in this picture. The downside to these thick walls, small windows, and general fortress-like building is that you got somewhat gloomy buildings. This was offset with frescoes and statues. But in a time where a cathedral was as much a business enterprise as it was a religious enterprise, and you needed people to come to your cathedral to make money off of it, well, being gloomy just wouldn't do. And that's when, ironically, another architectural style was developed. It's known as Gothic architecture, although that name wasn't given until much later. I say ironic because the modern Gothic uh, movement is known for its strong use of dark colors. And this is a style of architecture that's all about bringing light in. And just like the modern Gothic style was actually coined as an insult, so was calling this Gothic. People in the 16th century thought that these buildings were ugly, which is ironic because I think they're gorgeous. But they said that only the people who destroyed Rome could have come up with them. Now, the first Gothic building is St. Denis, and as you can see here, it looks a lot like a Romanesque cathedral, but it has a lot more windows. This reflects a couple of things. Paris was pretty safe. You weren't hiding from Vikings in Paris. Muslim raiders weren't making it all the way inland to Paris. So you didn't need your church to be a fortress. You needed it to be beautiful. And St. Denis was a revelation at the time. This new Gothic style combines several things that had been created earlier, but were put together uniquely for the first time in St. Denis. One was pointed arches. This allowed you to make arches that weren't symmetrical. One side could be longer than the other. Also, point support. And that's the idea that you can, instead of having a really thick wall to support a tall roof, you can have columns within the wall that provide all the support you need. And if they get too tall, you can put what's called a flying buttress, which is essentially a support. You can see one here and kind of all over. You could put those on and provide lateral support that way without making the wall thicker. It's still a very tall building, and the use of more windows and the lack of a need to really defend the church like a fortress makes the walls almost translucent. It allows daylight in and makes it a much more pleasant place to go. Now, this particular picture is of Salisbury Cathedral, which is the tallest steeple from the Middle Ages on the British Isles. It's so tall that when you look here, this isn't an optical illusion created by the camera. It's actually an optical illusion created by the difference in the temperature of air by the steeple as compared to on the ground. It looks bent when you're there. And since you can see there's a person right here, oops, you can see this is a massive building. Now, at the same time Europe is building beautiful churches, they're also involved in something that's going to be a little more grim. And that's a movement that becomes known as the Crusades. The background of the Crusades was that the Byzantine Emperor had sent a message asking for assistance, mercenaries probably, to help him fight the Turks, who were a new group that had just arrived in the area and were encroaching upon the territory of the Byzantine Empire. The Pope in the West wanted to help the Byzantine Emperor, partly in order to heal the rift between the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. They'd been one at one time. There was a feeling maybe they could get back together. Also, Western Europeans were angry. There was a traditional pilgrimage route through the Byzantine Empire over to the Holy Land. And the Turks were attacking people on that trip. Now, in the past, they'd had no problem with Muslims who were perfectly happy to have people visit the Holy Land. As long as you followed laws and paid for things, it was good business. But the Turks weren't a part of that business, and so they attacked people on their way. Also, there's a desire by the Pope and by the Catholic Church as a whole to increase the power of the Catholic Church. And what they're fighting against is an idea called lay investiture. And that was the tradition in Europe that local political leaders, kings, princes, dukes, counts, barons, they got to decide or invest the individuals who became local priests. The Catholic Church was arguing that the church should decide who became a priest, and this was really control over membership in the church. As part of this movement, there was a monastery at Cluny that became involved in reforming the Catholic Church in general, and they wanted the church to become larger and more powerful and richer. Cluny gained a lot of influence when a former monk from Cluny became pope. Now, at the same time the Catholic Church is trying to get more organized and centralize their power, there's also a push for intolerance within Europe. This comes from within the church, but also from social pressures. And people's behavior was being scrutinized more than it ever had been before. Part of this saw Jews come under pressure. Also, there were remnants of pagan religious practices throughout Europe. That came under scrutiny. Homosexuality, which had long been just seen as another form of sex outside of marriage, which was frowned upon but not really punished, suddenly became seen as more of a threat. Now, the first group of people who made it to the Byzantine Empire wasn't actually a military unit. It was a huge, tens of thousands of people were involved, a huge band of commoners who were led by a variety of dubious characters, ranging from a tailor to, at one point, a goose, who showed up. They had heard the call from the Pope and set off to set the world to right. This, of course, is not going to work well. They eventually did move into Asia. The emperor of the Byzantine Empire gave them food, warned them that the Turks would annihilate them, which is exactly what happened. They were killed in such a huge number that they formed a mountain of the dead, several hundred feet high, poisoned water for miles around. Oh, we found that, archaeologists, that is, found that in the 70s. From here, I'm going to have you do an assignment that I'll show you in just a second. I'm not going to go through the individual crusades because, well, your textbook does a good job of that, and you don't need me to. So this assignment is relatively simple. you're going to take a look at the various crusades, first, second, third, fourth, and the Reconquista, which isn't exactly a crusade, but is kind of one. And you're going to say what their intention was, what they accomplished, if anything, and what the bigger picture outcome was. And you'll do this and turn it in like we do all the other assignments. So that should be a quick assignment that will give you a picture of the Crusades. And the whole goal is for you to see it laid out so that you can say what you think the outcome was. Now, I've got some ideas, and I'm going to present some that you can't get from the textbook, but I want you to come up with your own ideas too. Now, there are some things that your textbook doesn't give you enough detail to answer about the Crusades. And one of those is, what are the big outcomes? Now, some historians have argued that there was an increase of trade because of the Crusades, that Crusaders got a taste for things like cinnamon. And that may or may not be true. More recent studies have debated this at great length, and it may not actually be true. It is true that Europeans had more exposure to the wider world, and it did definitely damage the Byzantine Empire. But another big picture claim is that the Crusades created a long-term bad blood between Islam and Christianity. And this is one of those things that seems obvious, but actually covers up a larger truth. The fact is that there had already been bad blood. Remember, Muslim raiders were raiding the southern coast of Europe, actually all the way up to England, all throughout the Middle Ages. And Europeans were responding in like. There was already bad blood. So the Crusades became a convenient scapegoat for this bad blood, but it doesn't really create it. And I should also mention that the Crusades generally get a negative reputation in modern academia. And in Europe, the Crusades definitely have a bad reputation. In America, up until relatively recently, the term crusade wasn't seen as a negative. It was seen as a positive. And it's really only been in the last 15 or 20 years that popular culture sees the Crusades as having been a bad thing. Part of this change has been because of historians who have argued about how bad the Crusades were. But you have to watch it with that. It's easy to go too far. A good example of that is this otherwise really good miniseries by Terry Jones, who's a historian who used to be in Monty Python. He made a miniseries with the BBC and the History Channel back in the 90s. The problem with the miniseries is it overplays how bad the Crusaders were. It uses questionable sources, essentially tabloid journalism, about the Crusaders, and then criticizes them when they do likewise. It's a pity because it's a really well-made documentary, but it can't be used because it goes too far. Now I'm going to skip part of the PowerPoint, which I'm going to leave up for you guys, but it talks about the English experience in the Middle Ages. And I do want to make one last comment about the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is a document limiting the power of the king that King John of England was forced to sign. And there's two modern views on it. As stated by the textbook this class used to use, some historians see it as a retrograde step that enhanced the power of the social elite at the expense of the crown. On the other hand, the more typical popular view is that it's a cornerstone of liberty, much like the US Constitution, which limits the power of the government. Just thought you should know there are those two different views of the Magna Carta, and it really depends on if you see the best political move being to concentrate political power, or if you'd like to put limits on that power. So this is George. I'm going to sign off here, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. But remember, don't tap that like button. Don't go to my Patreon because I don't have one. I'm not a YouTuber. I'll see you next time.